Hello, I'm Dr. Anthony Clark, and I'm a professor of Chinese history. This series is about the martyr saints of China. China is sometimes called the Middle Kingdom. And this second to the last episode is about the struggles of the Catholic Church in modern China, mostly during the Maoist period. And I'm joined today by a Jesuit priest, Father Paul Mariani, who is a professor of Chinese history also at the University of Santa Clara. And he just finished a book, actually, about the 1950s in Shanghai, about Catholic resistance to really communist sort of suppression or communist strategies to kind of suppress the church in the 1950s. And what's the title of your book, Father?
Well, it looks like the title will be, it'll be called Resistance, The Secret History of Bishop Ignatius Kong, the Jesuits and Catholic Militants in Communist Shanghai from 1949 to 1961. So it'll basically be kind of the years of my research, and I unpacked a kind of fascinating story, which I think people will enjoy reading.
Yeah, well, I know I've read your manuscript, and it's compelling and very active. Well, the reason we're here for this series together really is that you're the expert of the Catholic Church in the Maoist period. And it's an incredibly turbulent era, you know,
Yes.
and that's the reputation it has. But I wonder if you could say something, you know, because the communist government began when? 1949. So the first decade through the 1950s is really the beginning where the communist government is sort of standing on its legs in China. Can you tell us about what's going on in the Catholic Church in the 1950s?
Sure. In the 1950s, it was a very interesting period of time and a period that I wanted to study because you basically had limited religious freedom. It wasn't as if religion was outlawed yet, but it wasn't completely open. And what we see is a state after the Chinese Civil War between nationalists and communists. The nationalists went to Taiwan and the communists remained in China victorious. And they were trying to bring all people on board for their own project. It became clear that some people thought, well, how much will be kind of nation building, and how much will it be the goals of the state to sort of, say, suppress religion? In time, they found out that the state was pretty serious, that it was going to push an atheist agenda. And this is where I think some Christian bodies began to resist those policies.
Mm-hmm. So can you tell us, in a sense, what was going on with Catholics?
Yes.
I mean, what were Catholics doing? You mentioned the word resistance, and it's in your book title. How were they resisting?
Well, in Shanghai, what happened was it was very simple. Other religious bodies did not have to deal with it right away, but later they would. And that is, the regime basically said, look, you can remain Catholics, but just sever your ties with Rome, with the Pope, with the Universal Church. And Catholics at that time, being well catechized and understanding, said, well, not so fast. We don't do that. And the party responded, well, yes, you can keep the trappings of your liturgical life and you can still pray to God, but just cut links. In fact, Protestant groups were asked the same, to cut their ties with mission boards overseas. Mm-hmm. Not quite the same. It wasn't on the level of theology. For Catholics, it was. We don't cut our ties with the Pope. He is the rock. Mm-hmm. And so basically, it wasn't as if Catholics were picking a fight or wanted to kind of pick a fight with the regime. It was basically that they could work with the new government in building up the country, but they could not deny some essential features of their faith. Mm-hmm. So they basically went about certain strategies, and that is they were afraid for their survival. And what I found was a kind of a gripping story where in earlier episodes we talked about, say, martyrs being produced right away or during a massacre. Here we have kind of not so much a massacre, but a chess game, or like my manuscript, I think my book reads more like a spy novel, because on the one hand, the state is finding ways to control and penetrate and take over the church, and the church is not just taking it, you know, like being a lamb being led to the slaughter, but kind of step by step. You know, there's a part in the gospel where Jesus says he wants us to be gentle as lambs and wise as serpents. And I think that sometimes we're a little skittish about that. Well, wait a minute, what is this wise as serpents? But the truth is, I think Christians at this time were gentle and meek, but they also had to be very, very intelligent and smart. If the regime said something, well, how far could they get along with that, and how far could they say no?
Well, you mentioned an interesting point, and that is really that the communist government's, one of its largest problems was, well, the Pope.
Yes.
And we know that in their point of view, the Holy Father is sort of seen as an imperialist power, and they didn't want any of the people in China to really be beholden to some outside authority. And you mentioned something else I think is important, and that is you said that martyrs didn't happen in the way that we've been talking about in earlier episodes, i.e. they're not just dying at once, although there were some martyrs. But I think it's important to maybe distinguish the difference between, before we continue, between martyrs and confessors.
Exactly. I think this distinction is important, especially for this particular period of time. Why? Because in 1947, there were Trappists, men dedicated to lives of prayer and contemplation, quote, away from the world, not far from the Great Wall of China in the north. Well, the Communist Army had come in and basically forced them on a death march. Dozens died and perished. Now, what happened, this reached international news wires. People were aware of this and kind of got China a little bit in hot water. So they had almost, in this period, a no martyr policy. Be sure, do not kill religious personnel. Now still, there were some martyrdoms, but there seems to be a clear policy like, okay, we don't want to give people the excuse to resist us. So therefore the distinction becomes between a martyr and a confessor. For sure, later on there would be many, many martyrs. But for this period, the regime was very careful about producing martyrs. So the church for the longest time has had a distinction between a martyr and a confessor. A martyr basically going to your death for the faith, and a confessor just short of death. You could be harassed, ridiculed, bothered, sent to the salt mines or labor camps. And in this case, this is where this distinction, because I've actually talked to, in my own research, people that know it wasn't by a bullet or a sword they were put to death. They're very much still alive, in some case living to their 70s, 80s, 90s, but they have spent 20, 25 years in labor camps. Why? For their faith, but also because they would not renounce the Pope. So these what we would call confessors, people of heroic virtue. They've stood up, proclaimed their faith, not been put to death, but basically lost their youth in some cases, sadly enough.
I'm so glad you brought up these Trappists, because I think so few people know, and this is sort of relevant to the shift, I think few people know that the communist military in 1947, as you mentioned, took a group of Trappist monks who were just outside of, not too far from Beijing, on a death march, and many of them were killed and martyred during that death march. But then, of course, after the communist government is founded as the People's Republic of China in 1949, we see more confessors, at least for that first decade. And we've been talking too about resistance. One of the organizations that people read about often, if you read books about the Catholic Church in the 1950s, especially in Shanghai, and you mentioned it in your book, that is the Legion of Mary.
Yes.
Can you tell us about the Legion of Mary in China during this period?
The Legion of Mary was quite active in China at this period, especially among Catholics. Still, we have to remember that hundreds of millions of people live in China at this time. The Catholic Church is about 3 million. So still a tiny flock, but a vibrant and an effective minority, 11, hopefully, in society. And the Legion of Mary was a group that was active in China, and basically where they kind of ran afoul of the government was the biggest thing that they were doing was disseminating papal letters. So they were kind of forbidden in China to some extent, or the government didn't want people reading those letters because, let's face facts, Pope Pius XII at that time had a very strong anti-communist point of view. So there was a bit of a clash. There were certain, absolutely, no doubt, irreconcilable differences, meaning on the one hand, the church was against atheist communism. They wanted freedom of religion. And on the other hand, the communist regime was dedicated to building up China. They had a lot of goodwill. They wanted to build up the nation, but it would come at a price of only the party would speak in these areas. So what I found in Shanghai in particular was, say, 1949, after the communist victory, there was kind of a delicate dance, not only between the church, but other groups as well, unions or other religious bodies. And, how much freedom will we have? And that seemed to work for a while. So I would say there's basically three major acts. Early period, there's some pressure on the church. Taxes, the schools are taken over, religious schools are taken over by the government. They're forced to teach Marxism, etc. And then the first act was when the government said, look, we have to sort of take control of the church. So the first act was basically an attack on the Legion of Mary. And it was kind of maybe even, it was an intelligent move, but it would say, look, you can remain Christians, you can remain Catholics, but renounce your affiliation to the Legion of Mary. And of course, this name was a bit unfortunate because the government could say, a legion, you're obviously an armed force. They were not. But the name Legion of Mary, they didn't see them as spiritual soldiers, but actually as a military force. At least that's the way the regime wanted to cast them. Mostly high school students, mostly women, didn't seem to pose a threat. That kind of attempt backfired. Then there was a second attempt in 1953, to divide the church, divide and conquer, right? So the second method was to say, look, there's still a lot of foreign missionaries, not in the rest of the country, but in Shanghai, they kind of gravitated there. So basically an attack on the running dogs and the imperialists. So the imperialists would be foreign missionaries, their running dog would be the local Chinese clergy. So that attempt failed. So in 1955, the church was still resisting religious policy, and they decided, look, go for the jugular. 1955, September, they arrest Bishop Ignatius Kong, leading priests and leading Catholics in the diocese, 1,200 in total. Those people are brought to labor camps and prison. Still, they think they could work out a kind of a way forward, but as the government got more and more stringent, that turned out not to be the case.
I think this is a really good point to talk about. To talk about a Jesuit who
Yes.
I think for those of us who study China, especially Catholic history in China, we're all aware of a Jesuit priest by the name of Beida Chang. And you mentioned Bishop Ignatius Kong, and we should talk about him. But Father Beida Chang was, we might call him a martyr.
Yes.
Who died in this period. Can you talk about him?
Right. Father Beida Chang was a Jesuit, and I think very much a compelling figure, not only for the church in Shanghai, but for the church in China at the time, and hopefully maybe one day for the universal church as a whole. And why is his particular story so compelling is basically he died, as I talked about the three acts, the three major assaults on the church during this period, he basically died during the first assault, and that was the attack on the Legion. Also the papal ambassador, the internuncio, was expelled during this time, and Beida Chang was arrested. Fascinating figure. Why? Because even before he's arrested, he's sort of like a very charismatic, animated priest. He had studied in France, he had come back, and another Jesuit at the time called him the leading kind of figure of Shanghai Catholicism. In fact, some of the party representatives says he'll constantly outfox you, so watch him carefully, because any move you make against him, he'll find a way around it. So basically, his idea was to ensure the church's survival. So he's arrested, and it looks like what the government was trying to do was turn him, in a sense. Say, look, cut him, make him an offer he couldn't refuse, so to speak. Say, look, you can head the Catholic Church. He probably said, no, that's not what I do, it's the bishop. He said, no, you will head an independent Catholic Church. And we think this is the reason why he died in prison, constantly refusing those offers from the government. So very much a powerful symbol of resistance to that kind of policy.
And really probably a martyr for the faith. I mean,
Right.
Truly in the sense of the three aspects of being a martyr. I can't help but think about once when I was in China, it was actually during the Olympics, and just out of curiosity, we all know the internet is very restricted in China. I typed in the name Cardinal Kong,
Yes.
Cardinal Kong Pin Mei, and my access to the internet was blocked for an hour.
Wow.
They have their ways. But, here outside of China, if you type in to any internet search, Cardinal Kong, he's everywhere. He's perhaps the most, in that period, maybe the most famous bishop, the most powerful bishop in China during the Maoist era. And today he's one of the living testimonies, the living witnesses of resistance to the Communist Party during the Maoist period. And he figures largely in your book. Can you tell us about Cardinal Kong, who you've actually met?
Yes, I did. In 1995, I went with another Jesuit. He said, would you like to meet Cardinal Kong? So we went down to his clergy retirement home in Stamford, Connecticut. He actually gave us his blessing. He was mostly concerned about his priests in China. So just quickly, a background on Cardinal Kung, the first Chinese bishop of Shanghai. There had been a long line of foreign bishops or apostolic administrators of this region, and he's the first, named about 1950. So Bishop Kung meant a great deal to the Shanghai Catholics, that here we have a native son, so to speak, as our first Chinese bishop. And I think, here's someone born in China, loved China, raised in China, and he said he hoped to die in China. And the fact was, through these kind of political turmoil, he was set in opposition to the government. I don't think he took that on willingly, but he wanted to do two things: prove completely that he was Chinese and prove completely that he was a loyal son of the church. At this time, it seemed that they were trying to drive a wedge between that. So Cardinal Kung basically, as I said, 1955, was arrested, brought to the Ward Road jail in Shanghai, and basically lived there for 30 years. In fact, I had letters from the early 60s saying, we think he's on his last legs. Actually, he lived to almost 100. The story is, about 1979, John Paul II, just months or 10 months after he was made Pope, named Bishop Kung in pectore, that is in the heart, a cardinal. It wasn't until 10 or more years later, when Cardinal Kung was out of China, that he was actually able to accept that honor. And when Cardinal Kung received his red hat, so to speak, there was an unprecedented 8-minute standing ovation for his years of fidelity. Now, fascinating figure, but I think one reason why he has not been made a saint, because it's a long process. The fact is, there are still political sensitivities, and hopefully someday, if there's a closer relationship between the Chinese government and the Vatican, there could be a way forward. But right now, unfortunately, he's still unrehabilitated by the Chinese government. And we can say, well, what does that matter? He's still a saint in our eyes, true. But there's still, we hope, for some future dialogue, because we know China is changing, but we cannot brush aside the witness of these brave men and women.
Actually, he died in the United States and is buried not too far from the university that you teach at.
That's right.
Well, after the 1950s, where we have this resistance by the Legion of Mary, as you say, and Cardinal Kung is in prison, and many other Catholic priests and bishops are in prison. There was also another bishop during this Maoist period when then Bishop Kung was in prison. Can you say something about what was happening, say in China, for example, in Shanghai, when bishops who were loyal to the Holy Father, who refused to separate themselves from Rome, what was happening then? Were there bishops?
Yes, in fact, these were illicitly consecrated, so basically illegal, but valid in that they had received, if they followed form, valid. They were validly ordained, but not legally. So many Catholics will refer to some of those bishops as puppet bishops, or not true, or say patriotic bishops, or not true Catholic bishops. I think that their point of view was, we have to save what can be saved. But on the other hand, they had basically done the one thing that most Catholics had said they would never do, and that is distance themselves from the Pope.
Yeah.
So this is what had happened in this period. A man presented himself to be bishop during those years, and kind of had a murky existence because the church was much reduced. He did not have legitimacy, as you can imagine. Only a small group followed him. So this is the case that we have in the 60s, kind of a very sad case.
It's very known, too, that the faithful in China, especially during this initial era where they're learning that the government really wants them to separate from the Vatican, would often say, well, you ask us to denounce the Pope, which in a sense would make them no longer Catholic, but you now ask us to denounce the Pope, and next you'll ask us to denounce the Lord Jesus. So after this period, after the 1950s, into 1966, into this, what we call the Cultural Revolution, which went from 1966 to 1976, we have a very murky period historically, but a very turbulent, maybe one of the most turbulent eras in Chinese history. Can you say something about that period and maybe how it relates to the Catholic Church?
Sure. The Cultural Revolution period was a difficult period, not only for Christians in China, but basically for many Chinese as well. the nation was kind of turned upside down. It was chaotic. In fact, when we were in China recently, we had the very strange situation of having a Catholic man tell us that he had been a Red Guard during the Cultural Revolution, which was a bit shocking. But he said that it was almost like a fantasy land then, when the youth were set out on the streets to denounce their teachers, to denounce people in authority. So the church suffered once again. Ironically, some people who had been arrested early were in a sense safe in the labor camps. They were doing back-breaking labor, long political indoctrination sessions at night, but they were not targeted or attacked. Some were. It seemed that those who remained on the outside, they were more kind of vulnerable to kind of gang violence or mob violence. So basically, you know, if someone wants to collect this data of the martyr saints of the Cultural Revolution, it seems possible. There are definitely saints and martyrs, but it also seems a bit difficult because even today in China, it's a very sensitive topic. In fact, I think so because even some party leaders in China, their own children suffered during this period, were attacked by groups of, or mobs, and it was almost on the verge of a civil war. So yes, there were martyrs, and hopefully we'll know more about them in the future. Churches were ransacked once again, steeples knocked down, stained glass, but also all religious groups suffered in China. So a very unfortunate case, which I think rightfully so, China is trying to distance itself from and move towards the future.
You know, it's interesting. I met a bishop once, an underground bishop in China, who told me that just the first year of the Cultural Revolution, he was taken out in 300 Red Guards, and the word he used in Chinese was douzheng, like struggled against him. And he said that so many priests encountered these events where the Red Guards would struggle against them. Can you tell us something about what that was? I mean, we hear about the Red Guards and we hear about what they did. They struggled against these priests and teachers, but what happened during these so-called struggle sessions?
Well, often they were kind of mass denunciation campaigns where the person, and there's some pretty graphic photos you can see around of people being forced to wear these long white dunce caps with basically saying counter-revolutionary or something on it, and they're often kind of they had their hair clipped or cut randomly, and their hands were forced behind them, and they were forced to kneel down, and then everyone basically have at it, denouncing them for past crimes. So basically, witch hunts.
Witch hunts, yeah. I know this bishop was beaten quite brutally, and then finally he was put into what he called was a labor camp, a Laogai, for about 25 years. So this certainly was a terribly tragic period for the church.
In fact, I talked to one woman in this time about she had been in Shanghai, and then she was in the labor camps during this time, and she basically laughed, and she says, "Oh, don't ask about the Cultural Revolution, terrible, terrible." And she just went on, and I thought, wow, I mean, again, a witness to the faith of someone who has suffered immensely, but hoping to put certain things behind them and move forward. But a terrible period, yes.
So I wonder, we have about, I think, 4 minutes left, and I really want to make sure that you have a chance to say something about the church today.
Yes.
Because, you and I have been to Mass, and we see sometimes there are over 1,000 people in one Mass that we were in.
That's right.
And it seems like the church is flourishing, but there are still problems. Can you say something about, what it's like to be a Chinese Catholic in the pew?
Sure. I think there's something very compelling. I think that's why we want to have this series on the church in China. Is there's something fascinating, compelling, and almost magnetic about China. In fact, my own story is that I've been fascinated with China since I was about 8, 9, 10 years old, growing up in rural western Massachusetts and realizing that there was this whole other world out there where people thought differently, acted differently, and yet we shared a common humanity. That kind of captivated me from an early age. So it's been almost a lifelong endeavor, I think, for the both of us, this fascination for China. So if you go to China today, it's all of the above. It's a wonderful, fascinating, vibrant place. Loads of interesting things, not without its problems. I think for the average person, if they should go to China, they'll see a church growing modestly, not explosively, but growing, kind of a fascinating country, and also a great a sense of an indomitable spirit, an indomitable courage to come into the future.
one of the things that we both saw when we were there was that, you could go to a church and you could go to Mass, but you felt watched. There were security cameras, and certainly in one experience that I had, I traveled with some Chinese Catholics, and after I returned to the United States, received an email that they had been followed by the Public Security Bureau.
Okay.
In the last, maybe we have about 2 minutes or a minute and a half left. Can you tell us something about maybe an experience you had collecting documents? Is the government still sensitive about some topics?
I think religion is still a bit of a sensitive, definitely by far not the most sensitive topic. So the government has come a long way in the last 20 or 30 years. There is a religious freedom in some areas for sure. If a person visits China, they can attend churches, they can, and it seems very open. It's just in some areas that there, for sure, there's this other side as well. Mm-hmm. So I think both of the above. It's really fascinating at me, especially to see the faith of the people, that they've held on to their faith for years, in some cases for generations, and it's really some of my most moving experiences are definitely as a priest and talking to people from China and seeing their experiences. So I think for sure, just to see that faith that the church is alive. Mm-hmm. We talk about people we understand that Paschal mystery, we understand suffering and death, but we don't leave it there as Christians. We remember resurrection, and this is the hope, I think, which Chinese Christians live in.
Yeah. Father Mariani, thank you very much. Thank you, and God bless you. And we look very much forward to your book on the Catholic Church and its resistance in the 1950s. It really strikes me as we finish our discussion that when I was in China with Father Mariani, the faithful of one church lined up to receive his blessing, and it was a moving testament to their faith. There was a new priest in town, and a priest from, the United States. So I remember waiting in the room for Father Mariani to come to us because there were so many Catholics. The church is a beautiful church there, and it struggled. And there's something magical about struggle in Christianity. Somehow we Christians, when we're persecuted, we thrive. So, Father, thank you for enlightening us to the history of the church in that period. And God bless you.
Thank you.